Thank you for joining us. I'm Toufic Hakim, Executive Director of the Foundation for Self-Leadership. On behalf of our board and our associates, I welcome you to A Bridge Between Us, a series of conversations around issues of the times that we explore at the personal and societal levels. On this program so far, we've talked about civility, activism, issues of identity and race. Today, we explore conflicts and peacemaking. Pursuing peace, dear participants, may be elusive, a fool's errand, according to more and more skeptics, cynics, and jaded observers. I refuse to fall into that trap. And at the risk of sounding naive or idealistic, I want to submit to you that we have no choice but to facilitate civil accord and peace in any struggle, especially where it might lead to violence. Once violence erupts, it's so hard to reel it back. And its effects, needless to say, could generate shockwaves across generations. I spent my teenage years, sadly, in a devastating civil war, and I experienced its impact firsthand. We all know what violent exchanges can do, never leading to win-win outcomes. As I pondered before, I wonder again, what have we learned? And why haven't we learned from our experiences? Can we prevent violence and the downward decline of the human race, and how? Yes, violence and wars may have been justified at times in the face of oppression, aggression, and belligerence. Yet there must be a non-violent path out of any situation, even if it requires infinite persistence and patience and deep self-awareness and wisdom. What lurks behind our impulse to pick up arms or pick fights is maybe our surrender to fear and anger, letting our primordial survival instincts take over and control us. And in these situations, we find ourselves convincing ourselves that violence is the only way to stand up for dignity and our precious principles, and that we cannot gain peace unless we give in or give up our values and beliefs. We live in a world today where we must take sides. Are you with me or against me? The middle is fast disappearing, and we must hold on to it with all our might and not let it slip away. And of course, there's a new old game in town that's complicating things. Propaganda, promotion of untruths, crushing of civil discourse, and common logic that often leads to mutual agreements. We're so divided on so many fronts, on so many issues of equity, personal and religious freedoms, partisan politics, interpretations around science, public health, and extreme weather. And you know, when a cat is pushed into a corner, it behaves like a tiger. How do we tame that tiger? Way too many are stories of violent conflicts across human history, among nations, within nations, among factions, in our own neighborhoods, in our public spaces, workplaces, and homes. And let's not forget, conflict and wars in our own mind. Those impulses and how they're polarized. The polarization among our desires, stories we tell ourselves, beliefs we carry. Our conflicts inside of us influence the world outside, which then magnifies and amplifies our conflict 1,000 times over. It's said that our thoughts create our reality. So we project onto our reality what has not been resolved or what's activated inside of us. Dear friends, differences of opinion and belief are not at issue here. What's at issue is how they manifest themselves through judgments, decisions, behaviors, and language. How can I be aware of that? And do I have inside of me the capacity to shift my paradigm on war and peace and live and interact with others accordingly? This, I believe, is where hope lies. And this, fellow bridge builders, is the context for today's conversation. A polarized world exploring self-leadership in peacemaking. And I'm very pleased to be introducing our panelists today. Hugh O'Doherty is on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's the founding president of the Leadership and Peacemaking Global Network. Hugh participated and led a number of peace building initiatives in Northern Ireland. Inspired by his own personal experience, Hugh wants to contribute to a world in which all of us can make decisions and exhibit behaviors that take the whole human family into account. Lovely to have you, Hugh.
Thank you, Toufic.
And Les Fagen. Thank you. Les Fagen is on our board of the foundation. We're fortunate for that. He's also a member of a number of nonprofit organizations, including Our Generation Speaks. Les is a deep thinker with many talents. He's an attorney, a partner with the highly successful firm Cooley. He's also a co-founder and the leader of its Boston office. Les is a practitioner and teacher of Tai Chi and Qigong. And Les also, through his personal story and family history, is committed to contributing to peace in the long term. Les, lovely to have you as well.
Thank you, Toufic.
I thank all the participants for being with us. And Hugh and Les, please take it away.
Thank you.
We will do so. Thank you, Toufic. And I feel after that introduction and your introductory statement, I'm not sure there's much for us to say, Hugh, right? Toufic said it all in some respects, but I think it was a great introduction. Well, what we would like to do in this conversation is explore some different approaches to conflict resolution in a polarized world and discuss how IFS might be useful in that context. The conversation we're actually having today started between me and Hugh about 6 years ago. Hugh and I were both eager new participants in a level 1 training for IFS. And in the beginning of IFS, you look around and you realize 80% of the people in the room are therapists. So then you figure, okay, I'm not one of them. So you start connecting with those people who are not therapists. And Hugh and I made a connection early on, just started chatting. But it wasn't until actually I did my first level 1 training practice session that I began to realize that Hugh and I had something to learn from each other. It was actually my very first session, and I was paired with Hugh. And I remember, trying to go through the IFS protocol my first time. And Hugh decided, for whatever reason, to, and we'll discuss that a little while, to present me with what I would call this unrelenting wall of anger. And he said, well, I'm angry. I'm very angry. And I said, well, what are you angry about? I said, oh, I'm angry about everything. And I talked about the unfairness and meanness in the world. And every time I tried to use the IFS protocol to take it to the next step, it kept on returning to this. Now, whether he was testing me, I don't know. But as the session continued, I began to realize, even though the anger wasn't directed at me, that it triggered something in me. And what it triggered first was a sense of fear. And then I began to realize that I got angry back. And the only thing I can say is when the session was over, there was no self in my connection to Hugh. There was no compassion. I tried to act curious, but was I really curious? I was really dealing with my parts of how do I deal with this anger and how do I deal with my counter anger in return. So at the time, I felt like it was sort of a total failure, my first session. And the only C's, as compared to the vaunted 8 C's of IFS that arose in me, I would say were criticism, confrontation, counterattack. So after that, we went out to lunch that day or the next day, and we started to have a conversation and we began to learn something about each other. And while on its face, that encounter had nothing to do with legacies, what became clear to me and us over time that how Hugh decided to present, how I reacted had everything to do with the legacy burdens we were carrying in our lives at that time, and actually still do. So, Hugh, I'm going to invite you to start by maybe sharing a little bit about your story, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Les. Well, I have to apologize for that, our initial training. I knew you were going to be so good at this, I had to really give you the biggest test. I think that's what was happening.
All right.
But I suppose, you know, I grew up, like Toufic, I grew up out of a situation of deep conflict. You know, I grew up in Northern Ireland, as people in the audience will know. It's very divided. You know, the northern part where I grew up is part of the community identifies as Protestant and British. My community identified as Catholic and Irish. And this is a legacy of a centuries-old conflict between Ireland and England. You know, and Ireland, England went out and colonized all over the world and the legacy, the profound legacy of that process is everywhere. You know, and in a sense, Northern Ireland is sort of one of the last bastions of where the British still have a colonial power. So, just give an example of what that was like to grow up there. I grew up in a small town as a probably minority population of maybe like 30% Catholic. And when I was 8 or 9 years old, my brother, I had an older brother, 3 years older, he would take me to the cinema on a Saturday afternoon, and it was like the matinee performance. And that was all great, but there was a moment when the movie was over, which was a terrible existential moment for any Catholic in the audience, because what happened was the lights would go on, and the British national anthem would be played. God save our gracious Queen, you know, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth would come riding across the screen on a white horse. All the Protestants, you know, identifying as British, would stand to attention. And they would sing with great force, you know, God save our gracious Queen, God save our noble Queen. Now, if you're Catholic, you see, identifying as Irish, this is an insult. This is not your culture. This is the ultimate of oppression. But what do you do when you're 8 or 9 years old? So I would take my cue from my older brother, you know, and sometimes he would stand to attention, but not quite to attention. He would sort of shuffle, you know, talk to me. Other times he would walk, and I would walk behind him and sort of keep my eyes on the ground so I wouldn't catch any of my. This is a small town, so these are your neighbors, you know, that are in the cinema, because it was terrifying. Because this was to walk out was to insult their culture, and so this was a sort of, you know, at 8, 9 years old, this is the sort of thing that you're making decisions about, which are terrifying. You know, we didn't have the language of exiles and managers and all that, but it was profoundly threatening. And you know, but even like just this year, for example, or at school, we would hear about the famine in Ireland. You know, the English came here, they colonized Ireland in 1845 to 1848. We had a famine when 1 million people died, and 1 million people left the country, emigrated to the United States and Australia on what they call these coffin ships. But what I realized, like much later in life, we didn't deal with what happened after that. How does a people who have lost, you know, 1 million in a famine and 1 million emigrated, how do they recover from that? But what happened was then we just jumped quickly. The history jumped quickly to 1916, when we had the fight for freedom, you know, the Easter Rising, and drove the British out of the Republic of Ireland. And so just a few months ago, I'm sitting listening to an Irish poet. He's an Irish speaker. And he has a podcast, and he'll recite poems and he'll comment on them. Well, he recited a poem in Irish. And I was just overwhelmed in a moment. I was just taken over by this profound grief, deep sorrow. I started weeping, you know. And I had a deep sense that this sorrow is beyond me. It was like, it was the sorrow of Ireland, you know, it was like unbearable. It was, and I recognize there's something about why we keep, in a sense that the conflict in Northern Ireland, it's kept going in a sense, because the payoff is it keeps that sorrow at bay, you know. It never has to be dealt with because we're still in the fight. So, you know, I recognize that legacy that of the history of Ireland, the history of genocide, famine, all of that's in me, you know, and it's in the culture, and it's still unburdened in the language of IFS, you know. But what's been your experience, Laz, of your history growing up?
I'd be glad to share that, and I will in a minute. I just have a question for you on that. And as you dealt with this as a child, I'm really curious as to what message did you receive from your parents? You know, how to deal with this? How did they? How did they help you process this?
The message contained, it's best described in my only claim to fame is that Seamus Heaney, who got the Nobel Prize for Poetry in Ireland, he went to the same boarding school as me. So, but Seamus, one of his poems, he was raised Catholic, identifying as Irish, you know, but the title of one of his poems is, "Whatever you say nothing. Whatever you say nothing." And so that we grew up like, you don't dare speak, don't dare identify as not one of the majority. That was how we learned to survive, you know, this protective manager, like, don't speak.
So you lived with this internalized in many ways for many years.
Yeah, deep, yeah.
So we hear that, and that in some respects ties a little bit into my story. As Toufic knows, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors, and they were actually Schindler's List survivors. And you know, you hear about survivor families, and similar to what you were saying, they keep things secret. And in my family, it was a secret to the outside world, but within the confines of our house, there would be other survivor families coming over. And when they did, the stories would begin to flow. And these were stories about who survived, who didn't. You know, for those who've seen Schindler's List, the presence of Abu Awad, who was the commandant in that camp, was a presence in our house. We would often hear how he would randomly shoot people if you stood out in any fashion. And these stories just would continue. And there were so many times when you hear it, you know, a story of the near-death experience and how somebody survived. And these were the sort of, you know, fairy tales, I should say, of my childhood. And those were the defining stories of, some respects, my identity. And when my dad told these stories, he was an incredible storyteller. He told them with an incredible bravado, and it was almost like a cinematic vividness.
Yeah.
And eventually I began to understand, eventually, this is 30 years later, that he needed to do that. This was a way to overcome his sense of, you know, victimization, that somehow to talk about how he survived and overcame this was critical at how he presented himself to the world. My mother, who was more reserved, also shared stories. And I'm not going to go into them, but just to say that, you know, I remember talking about her celebrating her 18th birthday in Auschwitz, clinging to her mother and saying goodbye to her grandmother. And fortunately, there were stories of Oskar Schindler, who was a family savior. And I remember once, third grade, going to school, and the teacher went around the room and said, "Who are the biggest heroes in your life?" And I said, JFK and Oskar Schindler. And he was an unknown. Anyway, I grew up with this legacy of victimization and fear. And I grew up in an affluent, you know, suburb in Long Island. There was no place for these stories. There was no place for this reality. And the way you lived had nothing to do with this. But yet they were internalized all these messages that came out of it of, don't stand out in the crowd, don't take risks, create a massive safety net around you, all these messages in reaction. And I actually only began to become aware of the impact of this legacy and how it really infiltrated all aspects of my life, including our first practice session. In my late 30s and 40s, I remember going out with a colleague of mine to a restaurant, and he said to me, "Do you realize that every time we go out to lunch, you'll end up talking about Nazis?" And my instinctual response was, "Well, doesn't everybody?" And then I began to realize that, my whole worldview had been tainted by this. And I share this because I think, this is, my experience is, stronger than most in my tradition, although there are plenty of children of survivors. Carrying this sense of victimization and this legacy burden really creates a lens through which groups see, the world and really contribute to conflict. And it creates a whole set of defenders in our system. I think we all know it. They contribute to a cycle of reactivity and polarization. When I first said, well, what do I need to do about this? My first reaction was to be a defender, and I got involved in activities that were defending against anti-Semitism, protecting the state of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, I began to realize and feel that this act of defense, which may be appropriate and necessary, never seemed to go anywhere. Defense just produced defensiveness on the other side. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to get involved in an organization that I thought would enable me to make a positive contribution in a different way. And this is an organization that brings young Palestinian and Israeli entrepreneurs together in an intensive fellowship program. It's at Brandeis University in conjunction with MIT and MGH. And what we do is we ask them, and these are people who are willing to take this risk, because some of them, especially on the Palestinian side and the anti-normalization movement, would be at risk in terms of their own family opinions. But they look at social problems, they look at economic problems, and they create ventures of value and work together on it. And to me, this sort of became an opportunity to say, okay, we've got an intractable conflict here. Yes, there's dialogue. Yes, there is need for empathy. But is there a way to have people create a new reality, create something new of value? So anyway, I've been working with that program, and I think it's in some respects not dealing with the conflict head on because of the intractability of it, but what it is doing is working to create new realities. And I think we should, maybe stop there on that, Hugh, and transition a little bit, unless you have any questions on that. But what I'd like to do is move to the question of, what in your mind, because you're in conflict resolution work on a regular basis. What in your mind is sort of core to an intractable conflict? I mean, there are conflicts about land and resources, and those can be solved on, negotiation and technical matters. But there are these intractable conflicts that go well beyond, resource allocation and decisions about that. So I'm really curious.
Yeah. Well, my experience is, in the various models of conflict resolution, that like essentially, one particularly say what's called the human needs theory. There's the idea that human beings have sets of needs which must be met, and when it boils down to like a set of 3 essential needs. One is for safety, second is acknowledgement, and the third is identity. And the problem here is that those 3 needs are seen in the theory as non-negotiable. Now, obviously, safety, you can accept safety as a non-negotiable. Every human being should feel safe. It becomes problematic if if identity, you know, and is not negotiable, because then where do you move? So to me, what I've experienced is that this if dialogue is to be truly meaningful, and you bring, for example, Palestinian, Israeli, or British and Irish together, if it's real, you're not going to come out the way you go in. And there's this idealistic notion that somehow we bring enemies into the room together, each of them tells their story, we humanize one another, and somehow they'll all head off into the sunset and peace will happen. Well, it doesn't, and we see this all over the place, because, and this is where I think the contribution of IFS can bring a major contribution, is that unless those exiled parts are allowed to, you know, in the language of IFS, to be unburdened by, in some space where self with a capital S is present, unless that's happening, all the other stuff that goes on is superficial. You know, and you can have all sorts of dialogue that happens at a very superficial level, but the exiles remain protected, you know. And that, to me, that's what I've experienced, that there's a fundamental dynamic. And I go back to Vamik Volkan, who's a Turkish Cypriot who writes about this, that he talks about the need for an enemy. That when identity is constructed around the need for an enemy, it becomes intractable. You know, so the idea, like, and that I'm Irish because I'm not British, because I'm not those bastards, you know, that construction of an enmity system, and each party colludes in keeping it going, keeping it intractable, because you need the enemy to know who you are. That system has to be understood and has to be unburdened, in a sense, you know. And this came, I recognized this pretty early in my life. I was program director in the Peace and Reconciliation Center in Ireland. And we were bringing Protestant and Catholics together in Northern Ireland for dialogue. And then it started to dawn on us, you know, this conflict won't be solved in Northern Ireland, because this is just a reflection of this larger conflict between England and Ireland. It's almost like you have the children trying to come together when the parents aren't talking to one another. So we started to bring together Englishmen and Irishmen. And like, as I speak this here, I remember it vividly. The first workshop, we had 15 Englishmen, 15 Irishmen. And one of the Englishmen started to speak. And he started to speak with a very BBC accent, you know, hello chappies, talk with very BBC accent. Everything that as an Irish person, you want to, like, one part of you wants to kill, you know, you want to, like, just choke it. And the other part of you wants to disappear. You know, they're like these two parts. But the interesting was, as he started to talk about his experience of, you know, as a 9-year-old boy being plucked out of his family, stuck into one of these British public schools, and then being systematically abused by the older boys. And you see, and the hidden part of this curriculum was that these were the boys as young men who were so systematically abused in their own lives. They went out into the colonies, they were sent out into positions of authority in the colonial, like in Africa and India. And so they could rule. And they were so beaten down and abused in their own emotional beings that they were immune to the suffering and poverty around them. That's like the hidden part of that whole system. And as he talked about what that was like to be, you know, the subject of that abuse, he started to weep. And here I am. He represents everything about the enemy. He represents everything that, you know, is to blame for this, the horror of what happened in Ireland. And yet, he's just a human being, another guy weeping. And so this is what's so fascinating about this dialogue process when it's real. You're faced with an existential choice. You know, one choice I had was to, in order to keep my worldview in place, in order to keep, you know, my rage and anger at him, at the enemy in place. I have to shut down my own humanity, my own sense of, feeling for this man. So that's the cost if you make that choice. If you make the other choice, which I did, and allowed myself to be touched by his life, because I had been to a boarding school in Ireland, very violent place, punishment. So I connected at heart with that pain. But once you allow yourself to, identify with the other, then who are you? Your own identity, all that's sort of been clear and firm and kept you in your group is shaken. And of course, your own group doesn't want you out there muddying the waters about identity. They're going to suck you back in, So that can be a very lonely place. So I share that because I think underlying intractable conflict is this enmity system that gets created, built on exiled parts. And unless those are addressed, there isn't exiled parts can't feel empathy. So it's nothing. There isn't. It doesn't matter what's happening. There isn't going to be any peace.
Thank you, Hugh. It's a very powerful story. When you talk about identity being defined by rejection of the other, hatred of the other, it really makes me think, what's going on in our country right now in terms of, and this is the polarization we're talking about, that identity is not necessarily defined by positive values, at least at sort of advanced stages of polarization, it seems to me, but it's really defined in opposition to the other. And I think of the book, which I recommend to people, by Ezra Klein, called Why We Are Polarized. And he really goes through the history in our country of Republican and Democratic politics and identity. And what he really comes to the unfortunate conclusion is that we're at a stage in development of our culture or society where it is defined predominantly by rejection of the other, not by positive principles. And he goes on to even, give examples of things that one party would have believed at one point of time, but when espoused by the other party gets rejected. And the example he gives, the most notable one that I remember is, universal health care. That was initially, it came out of the Republicans, and Romney, implemented it in Massachusetts. But as soon as it became a rallying cry of the Democratic Party, Republican Party switched on it. So we have sort of this dynamic occurring in our country where it is identity defined by rejection and opposition, not by positive values. And it really makes me think, as even people with whom I share their liberal and progressive values, I actually cringe when they respond in hatred to positions which I don't agree with, but with this great degree of reactivity, because if both sides are exhibiting this reactivity, we're just locked into this polarized system where everybody reinforces the other without any movement or change. So it really raises, the question, and I think your description of your moment of seeing this person in pain and realizing the sorrow that the other person was experiencing, is that something that we can summon the courage to try and understand and relate to? And we may, not understand, what's driving, anti-vaxxers or whatever your issue is that maddens you. But if we don't find a way to empathize and relate, there won't be an ability to overcome some of these difficulties.
Well, I find what I find helpful in that, Les, from IFS is this idea that all parts are welcome. All parts are welcome, and if you distinguish parts, internal parts of the system, from the higher self, that's a profound place to get to. I think like there's a sociologist, political sociologist, I forget his name, out in Berkeley, and he talks about, for example, like the Republicans and the Democrats, and in a way it's sort of a simplistic idea, but it's interesting to think about it in terms of parts. For he would say, for example, what the Republicans embody is the idea of the father force. Be independent, stand on your own 2 feet, all wonderful qualities in some ways. It gets distorted when it turns into, a punishing autocrat. And he said, on the other hand, like the Democrats sort of represent or hold the nurturing parts, the mothering parts. And of course, we need both. We need nurturing, and we need stand your own feet. All of it, be responsible. All of that. But what we find is that they're in deep conflict, and we have this sort of really vile game now, where politics is nothing about policy. It's nothing about the well-being of people. It's a vile battle for the throne, for the seat of power. And utterly destructive and vile and sickening, and it's how do you kill off the other? So like I think that's we see this deepening, this in the absence of processes that can hold people, to begin to recognize these dynamics. Well, it just keeps escalating intractably.
On this issue, if I may, there's a question from Sharon. Thank you, Sharon, for joining us. About how do you respond to friends with whom you agree on philosophical or political issues, but then there's an anger and division in their response? Where do you start? Kind of going back to your point, Les, where do we start in these situations? How do we break that status quo or that stalemate?
I think for me, one of the questions is, and I think this is something I learned out of my first session with Hugh, was how do you respond to anger? Do you interpret it as anger that's directed at you, or do you interpret it as anger that the person is carrying as a burden? And I think if you can maintain the perspective of IFS and begin to be curious and stay self-connected, that person's expression of anger, I think, will begin to change. Maybe not all the time, but you have at least the opportunity for that to change in the process of dialogue. And actually, as you asked that question, I actually, as you mentioned, I'm a Tai Chi teacher. One of the things that is core to Tai Chi is how do you deal with a force that's directed towards you? And do you meet force with force? And the answer is no, you don't meet force with force. You hold the force in some sense. And so you understand, you accept the anger, but you don't respond with anger. You turn it, you engage with it in a way which comes from a place that is not reactive. So I think these are easy things to say. It's much harder to do in reality. So I don't know, do you want to chime in on that question, Hugh? Or?
I think you said it well, Les. It's not the capacity to accept and hold with as much grace as possible.
Right.
And not to identify. This is. I mean, you're right. It's very difficult to sort of separate the emotion and anger from self. This is why, to the extent that anyone, like particularly in third-party mediation, it's really important that the third party be in self, because then you can hold what surfaces, the inevitable rage, anger, despair, all that's in the system, then you can hold it and contain it. And I've learned, I operate in the world of like leadership. And one of the key challenges of leadership is how do you hold a mirror up to the system so it can see itself? So people can see the system that we're co-creating. And rather than take responsibility for that, we avoid that by projecting responsibility onto the other. You know, it's their fault, blame the other. And so we have this tit for tat, blaming the other. And so helping the parties see that it's co-creating a system that sabotages the possibility of the very thing they say they want, peace, and keeps it intractable. So yeah, that idea of containing, of holding, to me is like a profound challenge in this work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're asking people to do is really step out of the dynamic on some levels that they're in and they're locked in. And then the question is, where do they get the ability to develop that consciousness? And certainly, if you're doing IFS work with individuals within that conflict, I would imagine that creates that. But have you seen that sort of naturally emerge without outside facilitation, where some sense of self in IFS terms imbues a conversation and people's approach so that they can see the conflict that they're in and develop a different approach?
I've seen moments of it. I've seen moments in my own life in this. Again, it didn't have the framework of IFS, but I can look back and see. Like a couple of years ago, for example, I was invited to Venezuela. Venezuela is a terrible mess right now, as you probably know. And I was invited to participate to meet with 5 of the so-called leaders of 5 political parties who were in opposition to the government. And I got there and we gathered around a table, and each of these 5 leaders, one after the other, they told me that what they most needed was to come together as one body. And then it dawned on me that I figured, these people knew each other, they were in relationship, and I realized this is the first time they've actually met. And so I was able to pause the dialogue, and I said, let me tell you what I'm observing, So this is my opportunity to feedback, hold up a mirror. I say, each one of you has said you want cooperation, with one voice with this group, yet you've never met. So, and here's my hypothesis. There's something else that you value. You actually value staying separate more than coming together. Now, why might that be? I wasn't talking about parts, but that's essentially what was going on. There was one part saying we want to, be together, but some part was operating where they were staying separate. And so helping them see the contradiction or the gap between what they were espousing as a value of cooperation, but what was actually happening in their actions was very confronting but it opened up a whole dialogue, and it began to surface stuff that was hidden. Like there were at least 2 of the people in the room who could be the next president of Venezuela, but that wasn't talked about. This power thing in the room was hidden, but by sort of being able to sort of help them see the dynamics that they were acting out that they couldn't otherwise see, it was very helpful in opening up a space, for more vulnerability, more responsibility for the process. And I think this is a key challenge, and what your experience is, Les, that again, a lot of third-party mediation unconsciously keeps the parties dependent on the third party. And to me, that if I've learned anything over the years, there's a fundamental principle it's now in the cells of my body, and it's my DNA, and it's this, is that people only take responsibility for what they help create. People only take responsibility for what they help create. Unless parties in conflict, as part of the process of peacemaking, take take responsibility both for the content of the dialogue and the process. They either stay dependent, and then the third party leaves, and guess what? It all falls apart. And so, for example, in Northern Ireland, we got a peace agreement. People got Nobel Peace Prizes. But 25 years later, we have 20 feet high peace walls separating 90 of these in Belfast, separating Catholic and Protestant communities. Now, when they do a survey on each side of these walls, 80% of people in both communities say, we'd like the walls to come down. But 80% on both sides say, but we don't trust them. And so, you know, the technical piece of getting a peace agreement happens, but the real work of what do these people in these communities need to give up? How are they going to sort of allow the exiles these parts that are so traumatized and so fearful for survival to surface and unburden so that a new relationship can be built? In the absence of leadership for that, it stays stuck at the technical. And that's where, you know, that's where we are in many conflicts around the world, even though Nobel Peace Prizes are given out, you know, like the Oslo Accord and all of that.
Yeah. You know, as you're talking, it's making me think about how do we sort of transport the IFS model from a approach to dealing with an individual and parts with an individual to a group setting where groups interact with one another. And, you know, we all know there's groupthink and there's a sense of group mind, but groups begin to act as their own, or, you know, entities.
Yeah.
In many of the negotiations that I've been in, it becomes very clear, you know, who's, you know, the defender of history in the group, you know, who's the one that's going to be the firefighter and attacker.
Yes.
And you can begin to see people align themselves with certain roles, and that's their function in the group. But then it raises a question for me whether there's such a thing as a group self, and whether, you know, self can emerge within the context of, you know, a group dispute. And I'm curious whether you have any thoughts or insights of that, Hugh. So,
yeah, well, I don't think there's a group self. I think there's self, whatever language, you know, IFS call it self with a big S, whatever that is, call it reality, ultimate reality, call it the divine consciousness itself, you know, whatever word you use. To me, I think of it as like the divine, that there is the divine already the case. Before we sort of identify as separate human beings, separate identities, there's already the reality that there's only oneness, there's only the divine, right? That already exists. So,
right.
So that's that's, you know, that's where I come to in terms of is there a group self? But I'd say a part of this, but I resonate with what you're saying. When again, for example, you look at Northern Ireland, you have, to boil it down, you have a system that's part of a larger system. But within internal to Northern Ireland, you have, like in Protestant British side, you have two main groupings. You have a sort of a middle class educated group represented by the Ulster, what's called the Ulster Unionists. Ulster is a province of Northern Ireland. You have another group who are more, you know, working class, poorer, the Democratic Unionists. On the Catholic side, you have the educated, better off Catholics represented by the Social Democratic Labour Party. And then you have the poorer Catholics represented by Sinn Féin. So you have a mirroring. And then within both of these groupings, in the poorer groupings, that you have the violence, you have the men of violence. If the Irish Republican Army emanate from the, you know, Sinn Féin, and the Ulster Defence Association from the Democratic Unionists. So you have this system, and the men of violence act out on behalf of the whole system, the rage that those larger systems are holding. But then they get scapegoated. You know, the rage gets projected into them. And it's a way of denying the rage and hatred that's in all of us. And this is a huge problem.
Yeah.
How do you get the men of violence to the table? Well, you can't if you keep scapegoating them and keep labeling them and keep denying and you know their parts aren't welcome. It's a huge. How do you welcome the parts of the violent? You know, and so in that sense, there's there's a system of parts in the that get acted out in groupings within that larger system.
So I hear that loud and clear, and it's very powerful. And I think the group dynamic, part interaction and polarization and scapegoating, all that you've said, really rings true. I'm still want to press a little bit on how do you activate self and it to help contribute to resolution of conflict. And I recently came across a piece that I'd like to read because it's very powerful, and it was written before Dick Schwartz ever conceived of capital S self. And it is in Anwar Sadat's, it's kind of an autobiography, which he wrote in search of identity. And he wrote it while he was in a British prison, imprisoned by the British during World War II. And as you all know, years later, Anwar Sadat at Camp David reached a peace agreement with Israel. But I would just like to read this. I'll accept certain portions of it, but I think it's really interesting. So it starts, in cell 54, I could only be my own companion, day and night. And it was only natural that I should come to know that self of mine. I had never had such a chance before, preoccupied as I had been with work in the army and with politics and hurried along by the constant stream of life. Now, in the complete solitude of cell 54, when I had no links at all with the outside world, the only way in which I could break my loneliness was paradoxically to seek the companionship of that inner entity I call self. Through that feeling, which came to be an indivisible part of my very being, I was able to transcend the confines of time and place. Spatially, I did not live in a four-walled cell, but in the entire universe. Inside cell 54, as my material needs grew increasingly less, the ties which had bound me to the natural world began to be severed, one after another. My soul, having jettisoned its earthly freight, was freed and took off like a bird, soaring into space, into the furthest regions of existence, into infinity. Once realized from the narrow confines of the self, and here I think he means self with a small s, with its mundane suffering and petty emotions, a man will have stepped into a new, undiscovered world which is vaster and richer. His soul would enjoy absolute freedom, uniting with existence in its entirety, transcending time and space. Through this process of liberation, the human will develop into a love force, and all earthly forces come to contribute to the achievement of perfect inner peace, and so provide a man with absolute happiness. Now that I had discovered and actually begun to live in that new world, things began to change. My narrow self aspired to a higher transcendental reality. For now, I felt I had stepped into a vaster and more beautiful world, and my capacity for endurance redoubled. I felt I could stand the pressure, whatever the magnitude of a given problem. My paramount objective was to make people happy. I came to feel more deeply than ever the beauty of love. Love helped me to know myself. When my individual entity merged into the vaster entity of all existence, my point of departure became love of home, Egypt, love of all being, love of God. And so I have proceeded from love in discharging my duty, whether it was during my last few months in prison or now that I am president of Egypt. And when I read this, and you were talking about this divine connection, I mean, this is a spiritual connection. It's a connection to self in some fashion. And here's a man who reached very deep. And actually, I know you have observations about the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, but he reached deep to overcome the parts and forces that were at work in his society to actually extend a hand and make peace with Israel. But it raises the question for me, is that what we need in these conflicts is somebody who has somehow this profound connection, whether it's to the divine, to self, however you define it, and is in a position of power that can make a difference. Is that the only way, things can change in these really core conflicts? So having said that, I know you have some observations about Sadat and have a slightly different perspective on that peace treaty, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I agree. I mean, I think that, like I was saying earlier, like self has to be present in the third party for these processes, But Sadat's a fascinating story. There's a very powerful book written, I think it was Robert Wright, I forget, I may not have his name right, but it's 13 Days in September. And it's a description of what happened between Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat. So Carter takes these two men out of their communities to Camp David for quite a period of time. They're sort of, in a way, he isolates them from their communities. And the dynamics are just fascinating. And one thing happening is, I think that Jimmy Carter's parts as a Christian took over. He was so needed peace, not for them, but for himself. Unconscious is not to blame or judge, but he's like unaware, like he needed peace in order for him to feel like he was a good Christian, And meanwhile, the other two men were their own parts were operating profoundly. I think one of this it's not enough. It's not enough for example, the third party to be in self. Sadat may have this great, wonderful experience of, oneness with the divine, but he goes back to Egypt. He hadn't brought his own people with him. This is the leadership challenge. You can't make peace by yourself. It wasn't up to Begin and Sadat to make peace on behalf of their people. You have to bring your people along. And he lost that. And that part of the system that felt so threatened by that peace, his own people assassinated him. They killed him off. So to me, that's it's a fascinating study of these three men and the parts that are operating from this larger system. And in fact, unawarely, unconsciously set Sadat up for assassination. So, yeah, so that to me, yeah, it's how do you bring others along and unblending from exiles so that self is available? It's a key question in this work.
The conversation about Sadat also reminds me of a Palestinian nonviolent activist that I've done a little work with, and I've since introduced to Toufic, and we are now beginning with the foundation to help support a nonviolent activist movement. And his name is Ali Abu Awad. And Ali Abu Awad was initially a militant activist in the Palestinian territories. He participated in the first Intifada, and his mother was actually also an activist and actually was an advisor to Arafat. And she was put in prison. He was in prison twice. And he was imprisoned, for throwing stones, Molotov cocktails, and he was actually sentenced to a 10-year term the second time. And in prison, he began, and this is why I find it interesting, because you have sort of this inspiration arising out of people in deep isolation, where they only have the opportunity to look inwards. And while he was in prison, he started mulling this constant back and forth of reactivity and anger, and began to feel and realize that, yes, the parties are stuck in this intractable conflict. And he started thinking about the principles of nonviolent activism He desperately wanted to see his mother. And he decided to put the principles to work because from his point of view, it was essential that people see the humanity in one another. And the way he put the principle to work was he went on a fasting strike until Israeli prison would let him see his mother, who was in another prison located elsewhere. And after 17 days, they actually succumbed and they let him see his mother. And this was sort of the start for him of realizing there was another way to engage and encounter, where so you make your humanity obvious and you also force recognition of humanity on the other side. He tells a story where he witnessed an Israeli guard. It was either at a border crossing or in another access controlled area, was harassing, and I can't even remember, I remember the principal here. He was harassing, I believe it was a woman, and he wouldn't leave her alone and wouldn't let her cross. He basically said to the Israeli soldier, he said something to the effect of, this must really pain you. He said, I'd really like to hear what's going on in your life that feels that you need to do this, because there is this, and he engaged in that conversation trying to understand the soldier's pain. And within a couple of minutes of that conversation going on, the soldier just connected, and I think even began to cry, dropped his rifle and let the person pass. Now, these are people who have extraordinary abilities to connect, but it creates sort of an example, I think, of the kind of need to be able to really even recognize humanity in your oppressor, and to realize that need for oppression comes from some very deep pain and fear as well. So, how we move that into large group conflict places, I don't know, but it speaks to me very powerfully of what is really at the core of IFS.
Well, it's so listen, like it's sort of a sad reflection of where we are when the examples we have of men in this instance who have this opportunity to connect to the higher self, we're all in prison.
Right.
like Mandela,
Mandela, yeah.
Mandela, 27 years, and how he learned to, sort of, in a sense, respect his enemy and the person you mentioned. And it's fascinating too, because I can share a story about Northern Ireland, that members of the Ulster Defence Association, who were seen as like the terrorist killers on the Protestant British side, when they were in jail, again, they were like somehow this solitude, or they're away from life. They were able to begin to question, how come we're in prison when these politicians who are out there, supposedly on our behalf, they're living the life. Meanwhile, we're the ones in jail. So, and it allowed them to begin to see how they were being used by that system. And they came out, and that was part of what led to the Good Friday Agreement, like that transformation, that recognition. So, yeah, it's we need spaces other than prison for
I agree.
For this awakening.
I'd like to respond to a question that came up earlier, and it hasn't been responded to. I think it was the first question. And it was a question from a third-generation Holocaust survivor who says, how much can be transferred? And my personal belief in all of this is that so much of legacy burdens transfer. And that's the whole problem I think we're talking about, is that until groups of people begin to encounter their own history, process the legacy, understand how it impacts their lives, it will transfer consciously or unconsciously. I have a personal theory that within families, there's always somebody who is at at least one person who's the primary carrier of the legacy. But that legacies have a way of carrying on. And actually, they've done biological studies, epigenetic studies of how unresolved trauma passes on from generation to generation. So, it's sort of the group karma that continues to evolve. And I think, as we even look at the situation in our country, I think there's a lot of legacy burdens that are reflected on both sides of the aisle, and even the ones that, on the progressive liberal side, the positions come, I think, in part from legacy burdens and the reactions as well. So, I'm really a personal believer that there's got to be a way for groups to encounter, deal with the impact of their legacy, how it shapes their worldview, so that they can see the reality of the current situation. Because in a lot of disputes, I don't believe that one party actually sees the reality of the other party. What they see is what they fear from the other party, and they project fear and therefore can't take advantage of opportunity. They can't, it's so hard unless you connect to a sense of your own limitations and understand where those limitations came from for you to be able to see the other person real and in the present moment. So
let's on this point. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that's, again, one of the contributions of IFS, like it's contained in that. I like that title. I like that title of Basil Vanderbroek's book on The Body Keeps the Score, that IFS sort of locating in the body how the system is holding trauma, So I think that's a very valuable contribution. I think that can be brought into the world of conflict resolution, because so much of it so much of dialogue stays at a very cognitive level, like tell me your story and all. Right now, your generations are holding this stuff in the body, and being able to work with that is a tremendous contribution, I think. Yeah.
You may have answered a question by one of our attendees, but I'd like you to address it a bit more explicitly. And the attendee is questioning whether we should focus on the future when the past carries a whole lot of trauma, as some families do, where there's estrangement. And when you talk about unburdening exiles and dealing with legacy burdens, we're saying we have to go back into the past and deal with these issues and reconcile before we move forward. How would you respond to that?
I mean, that observation is very core to the kind of work I am doing right now. And that is that unless you find ways to create new realities for people, new ways to cooperate, and new ways in which people can contribute to each other's well-being, you are stuck in that historic dynamic. So the work that I'm doing with Palestinians and Israelis is very much a part of that, where you can find a project to engage with that is meaningful to both and solves problems for both, and you do it together. That creates a new reality, and the nature of the system, over time changes. So I totally respect that observation, and I think, they say time heals all wounds. I don't think it does automatically, because I do think these legacies just perpetuate themselves if they're not dealt with. But I think there's a lot of validity to that observation, and I think it's really important to find ways to create new realities which change the system.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had time to really dive into this, but my sense is you can't create new reality while people are trapped in exiled, traumatic history parts that are unconscious, that are in the body, in the cells of the body. That I think this is part of sometimes like the illusion of a lot of conflict resolution processes, that we can somehow tell each other our stories and we'll head off into the sunset, but it's, unless those exiled parts are, liberated There is no, they're not in self, you see, and we can't make peace unless we're in self. So this has been worth exploring.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that because I think you create the opportunity for the participants to enter into true dialogue if they can find a way to develop a relationship of trust and empathy outside of that context that sets a background by which they can now begin to relate and see each other as valuable human beings. So yeah. I think you're right. Ultimately, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict won't ultimately be resolved by economic cooperation and building resources together. But I think it could make a valuable contribution.
We'll take a last question from Glenn. Thank you for being with us, Glenn, and then maybe answer it and then give your closing statements if you don't mind, since we're approaching the end of this beautiful conversation, engaging and inspiring. Glenn is basing his question on your comment, Hugh, about identity and feeling the pain of the other, the enemy, which might lead to loss of identity with one's group. Glenn is wondering how we might explore the desire to build a shared identity. You know, how do we articulate among groups their own identities and then help co-create a new shared identity? And is that something that is feasible in your opinion?
This was an idea that was presented in Northern Ireland, you know. Say like since Northern Ireland Catholics and Protestants share the identity as Northern Irish, why don't we sort of have this sort of superordinate identity, and that we can all be one within that? But it doesn't work for the same reason we're talking about. It doesn't work because if I can't get there, ultimately, I think once the traumatized parts are unburdened, there is a shared identity. The shared identity is our humanity. We're all in this prior unity. We're one family before we're different, but we can't like experience how to live into that while trapped in trauma. So to me, it's not about creating a different identity. It's unburdening these deep wounds and hurts, so that what is freed is the realization that we are one. I mean, it's what all the great spiritual traditions espouse to begin with, you know, that we're one family, there's only oneness. But at an espoused level, that's fine, but we don't get there while we're, you know, trapped in these deep legacies of profound hurt, and healing needs to happen.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I think that ultimately finding that connection to self, which transcends these victimized and defensive parts and shame parts, is key to all of this. And I actually, as we talk, I think back and remind the viewers who may have seen it, you know, a number of years ago, Dick and an Israeli IFS therapist did some work with Palestinians and Israelis. And what was clear is as each one worked through their legacy burden and found a way to release it and put it down, they both independently, they weren't in connection with each other at the time, came out with this vision of a common humanity that really interconnects all of us. And I think that is very powerful. And on some levels, it's the key. When I muse, how do we get enough people to do that so that real change can happen? You know, I draw a question mark, but I think it is key. And I think we've lost the ability in society, because while religion is responsible for many ills in the world, there was also deep spiritual connections that was created through religious traditions over the years that potentially could contribute to some of this. So is IFS the answer? I think it's part of the answer going forward, but we will see.
Well, thank you both so very much. You left us with a lot of open questions, but there's a glimmer of hope, right? Despite what history has taught us, that we have to persevere and figure out how to hold the force without force, and how to figure out how to look at the other as not dissimilar from who we are at the core. And that's a tall order sometimes when we're in the midst of pain. But what's clear to me is that we have to figure out how to deal with the traumas of our own, life and our parents and our cultures, if we want to really move forward together. This was a very engaging conversation, and this brings this phase of a bridge between us to a close. I'm glad to have had you, Hugh, and Liz with us today, and I appreciate the participants' engagement. Until next time, thank you and stay safe.